Oh, thank you so much for that intro, Mary. It's always such an honor to be on the lead dev stage. I usually say something really pithy here about how much lead dev has meant to me and how it's affected my growth of my career. But I decided this time that I would save that for the end. So we're just going to jump into the story. It's hard to comprehend just how vast the Pacific Ocean is. The challenge starts with the fact that this is the map that we usually see. It keeps the Atlantic intact and splits the Pacific in half. Now, some of this is historical because most of the early mapping was done by European explorers, and some of it's just practical. There's not an easy way to split the Atlantic without slicing Greenland right in half. But if we spin the globe, the size of the Pacific becomes a little bit more apparent. The Pacific Ocean is roughly 1/2 of the Earth's surface water area, 1/3 of the entire surface of the Earth. A quick hop from New York to Lisbon weighs in at about 3,400 miles, whereas a trans-Pacific flight at a similar latitude from LA to Tokyo is 5,500 miles, a little over 2,000 miles further. And this vastness is what made the task that Jay Prochnow had signed up for so daunting. The year is 1978. Jay is 36 years old and a veteran U.S. Navy pilot who flew in combat over Vietnam. So he's got plenty of time in the cockpit, some of it in less than ideal circumstances. Prochnow was working as a delivery pilot for Transair based out of Oakland, California. And that's how he got himself into this mess. Transair had signed a contract to transport 2 Cessna 188 airplanes from their base at Oakland across the Pacific to a buyer in Sydney, Australia. The Cessna 188 is known as the Ag Wagon because it's an agricultural aircraft. It's primarily used for aerial spraying operations. It's a crop duster. Clearly, it's not an aircraft designed for extended overwater operations. So why do it? Well, it turns out that when a small plane like this needs to move from one continent to another, it's usually cheaper to rig it up with extra fuel capacity, buy a lot of insurance, and pay a pilot to make the hazardous trip than it is to take the wings off, put it in a crate, and put it on a ship across the ocean. And so that's what they do. But even with a few hundred gallons of extra fuel on top of the plane's 56-gallon tanks, there's no way the slow-flying 188 could make the journey from Oakland to Sydney in one go. They'd have to island hop. The journey would take them from Oakland to Honolulu, to Pago Pago, American Samoa, to Norfolk Island, Australia, and then finally to Sydney. It would take 4 legs on 4 separate days to make this crossing. And these would be long, grueling days, flying 12, 15, sometimes up to 18 hours, cooped up in the 188's tiny one-person cockpit. And the flying would be out over the open ocean where there's literally nothing to look at but water as far as the eye can see, and nowhere to land if you need a break. What's more, the 188 doesn't have an autopilot, so Prochnow and his tripmate are going to have to hand fly their respective planes the entire way across the Pacific. First couple legs went without any problems, long but uneventful. But shortly after 3:30 a.m. on December 19th, as the pilots were taking off from Pago Pago, disaster struck. Prochnow took off first, but his partner's plane barely made it off the ground, crashing into the ocean right off the end of the runway. Prochnow circled back to the field and landed as quickly as he could, thankfully discovering that his friend was alive and relatively unhurt, but the plane was totaled. Once the quick investigation was complete, revealing the plane's fuel pump had seized up just after it took off, his partner was on a Hawaiian Airlines flight back to the States. But Prochnow still had a plane to deliver, whether he had a partner to do it with or not. And so that meant that a couple days later, Prochnow found himself again on the apron at tiny Pago Pago Airport at 3 a.m, alone this time. His next stop was tiny Norfolk Island, 1,475 nautical miles away. He expected this flight to take him between 14 and 15 hours, depending on the wind, but he loaded enough fuel to fly for 22, just in case. He was leaving at 3 a.m. so that he could be sure and get to Norfolk Island while the sun was still up, because Norfolk Island is a literal postage stamp. It's 3 miles by 5 miles at its widest point, in the middle of the open ocean, 400 nautical miles from anything else. It would make it a lot easier to land there if he could see it. So after an uneventful takeoff and a very slow climb out because of all of the fuel that he was carrying, Prochnow pointed his plane to a heading of 220 degrees and settled in for the long flight to wait for sunrise. only there really wasn't much settling in to be done. Remember, he didn't have autopilot, so he's flying the plane by hand. And this is 1978. There's no GPS. There's no iPads. He's literally got a paper chart folded out on his lap, looking for landmarks and charting his position as he goes so he can keep track of where he is. But despite the lack of GPS, he does have one tool in addition to what he can see out the window to help himself fly along. There are thousands of non-directional beacons, or NDBs, scattered around the world. They're the historical backbone of radio navigation. Now, these are very simple transmitters broadcasting their identity over and over and over again in Morse code on an AM carrier signal. They're indicated on charts by this radial dot pattern. And this particular example is Lakemba, an island in southern Fiji that was early in Prochnow's route. The 391 in the legend is the AM frequency that the station broadcasts on. LK is the station identifier, the thing that it's broadcasting over and over again. And it's helpfully written out on the chart in Morse code as well, so that you can make sure you're hearing the right station when you tune it in. In the cockpit, a pilot would tune in an automatic direction finder to be able to follow one of these beacons. This is what that looks like. The automatic direction finder receiver gets tuned to the frequency of the station that you're wanting to hear. You can punch a button to hear the audio so that you can hear the Morse code and tell if it's the station that you want to be listening to and want to be flying towards. And then a directional and static antenna combination on the plane can detect which direction that signal is coming from. And that direction is displayed on the automatic direction finder indicator in the cockpit. In this example, if you were flying due north, 0 degrees, you could turn your plane to a heading of 120 degrees and you'd be flying roughly straight at the transmitter. These simple bearing indications are the only thing he had to go by other than what he could see out the window. But there were a bunch of them, at least for the first part of his trip. But once he was out of range of the beacon at tiny Onoilau, he had several hundred miles of flying ahead of him with no landmarks and no radio beacons. But this wasn't a problem. Prochnow was a skilled navigator, and he knew that if he just followed the heading that his charting had established for the first part of the trip, he'd eventually pick up the powerful beacon on Norfolk Island. He could tune into it, and he would be able to follow it in to the island. So once he lost Onoilau, he turned his ADF to 260, and he listened for the telltale Morse code NS to start coming through. And sure enough, after about 11 hours in the air, there it was. Scratchy and faint, but it was enough for his automatic direction finder to indicate the transmitter was straight in front of him, exactly where he expected it to be. At this point, Prochnow checked in with Auckland Oceanic Control, who were in charge of this section of the ocean, and he gave them his estimated arrival time of 4 p.m. local time, Norfolk Island. 3 hours later, Prochnow was squinting into the afternoon sun, looking for Norfolk Island, not seeing much. An hour after that, his arrival time came and went, with still no sign of Norfolk Island. His ADF still pointed straight ahead, and he knew he might have been fighting more of a headwind than he realized, so he wasn't too worried yet, but he went ahead and radioed Auckland Control just to let him know that he wasn't going to make his expected arrival time. He was going to be delayed a little bit. 30 minutes later, when he still hadn't spotted Norfolk Island, he tuned in 2 other beacons that were barely in range to double-check his location. And the fix he got back from them wasn't even on his chart. He could not plot the position that they said that he was at. That was a little concerning. So he tuned back to Norfolk Island. But only now, instead of being right in front of him, the ADF said that it was off to his south somewhere, completely different direction. He hadn't turned the plane at all. He's still flying straight. But the ADF was indicating something completely different. He'd been following the arrow of his automated direction finder, and he knew now that it had led him precisely to the middle of nowhere. And so Prochnow did what any good pilot would do at this point, and he ran a quick assessment of the situation. He had no functional navigation equipment and no land in sight, so no means of knowing where he might be. He had about 7 hours, or he had 3 to 4 hours of daylight left, and he had about 7 hours of fuel. Of those, the only one he could do anything about was the fuel, so he dialed his fuel mixture back as lean as it would go and slowed the plane down, hopeful that he could eke a little bit of extra time out of it, but it was going to be an extra hour at most. Once that initial triage was complete, he radioed Auckland Oceanic to declare an emergency and to ask for any assistance they might be able to provide. Closest available search and rescue aircraft was a Royal New Zealand Air Force Orion at Wainapai Air Force Base outside of Auckland, but it was just back from a mission and nowhere close to ready to take off. By the time it was refueled, re-equipped, and recrewed, it would take the Orion 3 to 4 hours to reach the search area. Prochnow only had 7 hours of fuel, so even if they did find him, that might not give him time to make it to land. The only other option was an Air New Zealand DC-10 that had taken off from Fiji, headed for Auckland about 20 minutes prior. This was literally the only flight, commercial or military, that would be operating in that entire segment of ocean for the next several hours. The DC-10 had a projected flight time of 3 hours from Fiji to Auckland, but if it went straight to Norfolk Island instead, it could get there in about 90 minutes. So as soon as the plane was above 10,000 feet, Fiji Departure relayed a message from Auckland Oceanic asking the DC-10 to get in touch. And once they heard the situation, Captain Gordon Vett and his crew did not hesitate. They immediately set course on a heading that would put them just to the east of Norfolk Island, where they suspected that Prochnow was. And then Captain Vett got on his intercom to break the bad news to the passengers that they were going to be delayed. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received news from Auckland of a light aircraft lost in the region of Norfolk Island. And since we're the only suitable aircraft in the vicinity, we've altered course for the search area to offer assistance. The pilot is in serious danger of ditching, and if he lands on the water, his chances of survival will be remote. Could mean a rather late arrival in Auckland, but with a life at stake, I'm sure you understand that all help should be given. And then in classic Kiwi deadpan, if anyone objects, of course, we could always leave him to die. And of course, nobody objected. Now, as if a plane that just happened to be in the area and able to reach the search area wasn't lucky enough, there was actually a lot more stacked in favor of Prochnow here than anybody knew at this point. First, this Air New Zealand plane was planning on doing a quick turn at Auckland to head on to Wellington, so it was carrying enough fuel to not have to take on fuel at Auckland. Not only that, fuel was apparently really expensive in New Zealand in 1978 compared to the rest of the world. So the plane was tankering. It had brought enough fuel to be able to fly to Auckland and then Wellington and then wherever it was going the next day without needing to get more gas. And that meant that it could stay in the air pretty much as long as it needed to find Prochnow and still get back to Auckland without any problem. Second, in addition to being a pilot, Gordon Vett was also a licensed aviation navigator. The DC-10 he was piloting had electronic navigation equipment and flew with a 3-person cockpit crew of a pilot, a co-pilot, and a flight engineer. But much of Air New Zealand's fleet in 1978 was still the Douglas DC-8. The DC-8 did not have electronic navigation equipment. It still required a 4-person cockpit crew, including a navigator. When Vett had been a co-pilot on the DC-8, by company policy, he had been trained and licensed as a navigator to give them crew flexibility. Not only that, it turns out that Vett wasn't the only navigator on board. As soon as he made his announcement to the passenger cabin, a flight attendant rang him and said, "I've got another navigator licensed pilot on board. His name is Malcolm Forsyth. He's offered any assistance that he can possibly provide." And so Captain Vett, of course, invited Forsyth up to the cockpit to join himself, First Officer Arthur Dovey, and Flight Engineer Gordon Brooks in the cockpit. Vett was in contact with Prochnow already over long-range, high-frequency radio, but that's not a great connection, and it was hard to understand what Prochnow was saying over the noise in the Cessna's cockpit. As they got closer to the search area, Vett asked Prochnow to start transmitting periodically using his VHF radio as well. VHF has a maximum range of about 200 nautical miles, so they knew that when the DC-10 picked up Prochnow's transmission, that he was somewhere in a 200 nautical mile circle somewhere around them. It would still be a hugely and impossible search area. They had to start somewhere. As they waited for Prochnow's VHF transmission to come in, the setting sun gave Captain Vett another idea. He asked Prochnow to point his plane straight at the setting sun and read back his compass reading. And he did the same thing in the DC-10. Prochnow radioed in a heading of 274 compared to the DC-10's heading of 270, due west. And that was enough for them to know that the DC-10 was south, or the Cessna was south of them exactly as they expected. So it confirmed that. But was it east or west of them? To know that, Vett needed to know how high above the horizon the sun appeared from their respective positions. Because the sun sets to the west, it appears higher above the horizon the further west that you are. Unfortunately, neither aircraft had a sextant on board to measure arc above the horizon, but Vett remembered a way to estimate it in an emergency. He told Prochnow to hold his fist at arm's length and measure the distance between the horizon and the sun using his fist and his fingers. Prochnow quickly replied with a laugh, "That's impossible. I can't even stretch my arm halfway out in this tiny cockpit." So Vet improvised. He and Prochnow both held their hands about a foot in front of their faces and took a measurement. Prochnow's and the Cessna came in at 4 fingers, and Vet's from the DC-10 came in just under 2. So because the sun was higher in the sky for Prochnow, he had to be west of the DC-10 as well. So they could say conclusively that he was southwest of their position. But they could get even more precise. Vet knew that each finger indicated about 1.75 degrees of arc. So a 2-finger difference meant 3.5 degrees of arc, or 210 arc minutes. The reason nautical miles are used for ocean and air navigation is that they're defined as 1 minute of latitude, and it turns out that's really convenient when dealing with great circle distances. More importantly for us, that meant that Vet could use the difference in their observations of the position of the sun to estimate that Prochnow was approximately 200 nautical miles southwest of them. Something like this. They knew they were on the right track when a minute or two later, the first officer picked up Prochnow's crackly voice over the VHF radio. They had now managed to narrow their search areas significantly. They asked Prochnow to fly the inverse of their course, with the DC-10 moving at 500 knots, the Cessna moving at about 100. They estimated they'd be right on top of the Cessna's position in about 20 minutes. But the sun was setting, and that meant that it was going to be almost impossible for the DC-10 to spot the Cessna, and very hard for the Cessna to spot the DC-10. They checked with their dispatch, and unfortunately the weather conditions were not right for them to be generating a contrail, which would have helped greatly the Cessna's ability to see them. But they improvised and did the next best thing. Right as they flew over the predicted rendezvous point, the first officer opened the plane's fuel jettison valves. There was a nozzle under each wing that could dump 2.5 tons of fuel per minute combined. Now, usually this would be used in an emergency right after takeoff, because a plane can take off carrying more weight than it can land with. So if there's an emergency right after takeoff, it has to dump the fuel that it would have burned up in transit so that it's safe for it to come in and land. But it also happens to make a really spectacular vapor trail in the sky. They dumped fuel for 5 minutes, a total of 12 tons of fuel. But it didn't work.
If you're enjoying this, then Lead Dev's got loads more to offer and there's tons to explore.
So the reason I love Lead Dev so much is they've got such a range of content on so many different topics in the world of engineering, leadership, and management.
So Lead Dev helped a lot on building my own career, right? And it's great to also see how it's helping the new generation as well.
Make sure to sign up and join us at leaddev.com.
A dejected Prochnow radioed, "It's hopeless. I can't see anything." Now, Prochnow had been calm and collected up to this point, but he was starting to break down a little bit. He'd been in the air for around 19 hours at this point. Fatigue was getting the best of him, but Vet wasn't ready to give up. He had one more trick up his sleeve, a technique called oral boxing. Now, I mentioned earlier that VHF radio will only transmit about 200 nautical miles, and this is why. VHF is a line-of-sight transmission. Now, obviously, this is an exaggerated diagram, because we're not talking about spacecraft, but as the planes fly apart from each other, the curvature of the Earth will eventually block the propagation of the signal. A skilled navigator can use this knowledge to triangulate the location of a static, or in this case, a very slow-moving transmission source. Let's get a little closer to see how this works. So oral boxing involves flying 2 perpendicular courses and then recording where the signal was acquired and lost along each course. Vet had thankfully plotted where they had first acquired the Cessna signal, and for search purposes, the Cessna hadn't flown far enough to invalidate this point. So they continued flying at their current southwesterly heading, having Prochnow transmit at regular intervals until they lost his signal. Then they looped around to a perpendicular course and did the same thing the other direction. Now, this was not a fast process, as each of these legs could theoretically be up to 400 nautical miles long, but it was their best bet since they'd not been able to make visual contact yet. Once they'd flown the 2 perpendicular paths, they could chart a circle. This circle represents the transmission horizon of the VHF source, where the signal is lost to the Earth's curvature. Now, the geometry of circles tells us that if you find the midpoint of each of these lines, and then you draw a perpendicular bisector, you'll have the center of the circle. and that's where the signal should be emanating from. Took them a little bit over an hour, but they were now pretty sure they could find Prochnow at 30 degrees south, 171 degrees east. As soon as they knew those coordinates, Vet radioed Prochnow to fly in a circle and watch out for our strobes. We'll be overhead in 5 minutes. Instead of the fuel trick again, it was now getting dark, and they figured that he would have a better chance of seeing this. Now, these are anti-collision strobes from an Airbus A320, but they look the same on roughly every aircraft. It's a standard part of commercial aviation. And these lights could be seen for miles, especially now that it was dark. Except apparently by J. Prochnow. His hopes fell just as fast as they had risen. On board the DC-10, Vet encouraged the passengers to peer into the darkening night, looking for little Cessna's dim light. He even invited passengers up to the cockpit to help him look, but no luck. Prochnow went ahead and turned out of the circle to fly northwest based on Vet's fix in hopes that he was at least moving in the right direction towards Norfolk Island. But he was beginning to resign himself to ditching in the Pacific and all that entailed when he saw something. "A light!" came Prochnow's transmission over the radio. "I see a light on the surface. I don't care what it is. I'm heading for it." "Roger. Aim straight for it and read back your heading," replied Vet. 310, replied Prochnow. "Looks like some sort of tall structure on a platform. I can see 2 tugs towing it." The consensus on the DC-10's flight deck was that it sounded like an oil rig. "That's exactly what it is," replied Prochnow. "Roger. Let us get in touch with Auckland and see what details they can give us on if there's an oil platform in the area." The rescue coordinator at Auckland took a few minutes to find the information, but radioed back that it was the Penrod, an oil rig being towed from Auckland to Singapore. And its current position was 31 degrees south and 179 degrees and 21 minutes east. That meant that Prochnow's position was more than 600 nautical miles east of Norfolk Island. There's no way he would make it. "You're going to have to ditch," Vet radioed. "But don't do anything until we get there. We can help light up the area to help with the rescue." So the DC-10 made a turn eastwards toward the rig's position, and Prochnow kept circling the rig with its lights flashing. He apparently had gotten their attention because every light on the Penrod was now illuminated, and the tugs had pulled the rigs to a stop, and they'd launched a boat, anticipating that an airplane flying a circle around them with its lights flashing might be in trouble. So Prochnow descended to take a look at the surface, and his heart fell even further. The sea was at 15 to 20-foot swells, meaning it would be all but impossible for him to touch down cleanly on the surface and give himself time to get out of the plane before it sank. More likely, it would break apart around him, and he would be lucky if he survived the crash long enough to even be rescued. But something strange happened as the DC-10 flew towards the rig's position. Prochnow's radio transmissions started to fade. Captain Vet, still surprised that his calculations of Prochnow's position had been so far off, was suspicious. So he radioed Auckland and said, "We're having some problems with the rig's position. Can you pass us a frequency so we can talk to them directly?" And soon Vet was in touch with the rig's radio man. They confirmed a light aircraft circling in their vicinity and that they were prepared to make rescue. "Can you confirm your position?" Vet radioed. "We have you at 31 south, 179 and 21 minutes east." The reply quickly came back. "Negative, New Zealand. We're at 31 degrees south, 170 degrees, 21 minutes east." Whether it was a mistake by Auckland or a misunderstanding of the high-frequency radio, we'll never know. But it turns out that Vet's initial calculation was almost right on. Vet immediately got on the radio. "You may not have to ditch after all. You're closer to Norfolk than we thought." So the DC-10 turned back towards Prochnow and flew at top speed while descending down to 10,000 feet to make it easier to spot him and the Penrod. By Prochnow's rough math, he'd have the extra hour of fuel he needed, but it wasn't guaranteed. And if he had to ditch, his odds would actually be much better near the rig with a crew in the water ready to rescue him than alone off the coast of Norfolk Island. He took one more look at the churning sea, though, and that made his decision. "I'm going to go for it," radioed Prochnow. "Give me a heading, and I'm off." "Steer 294 magnetic," was Vet's reply. "We'll catch up to you shortly and guide you into Norfolk." So scared and exhausted, but hopeful again, Prochnow turned away from the bright oil rig and into the darkness. But a few minutes later, the crew in the cockpit of the DC-10 looked out their window and finally spotted the dim lights of the Cessna for the very first time. They had actually finally found J. Prochnow. Captain Vet got on the intercom to share the moment with the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look out the left windows about 70 degrees to the left and below, you'll see something very interesting. It's difficult to spot, but if you look carefully, you'll see the dim lights of the Cessna. The passengers cheered, and they took turns looking out the windows and helping each other spot the dim lights of the tiny plane. Vet then radioed Prochnow. We'll set a course for Norfolk. Follow our lights, and if you lose sight, just let us know. We'll double back to pick you up again. J. Prochnow had now been in the air for 22 hours since leaving Pago Pago that morning. And if you remember, he had loaded 22 hours of fuel that morning, thinking surely it was adequate for a trip that was expected to last 14 to 15 hours. But now he was 100 nautical miles from safety and was flying at 100 knots. He hoped his math was right, that he'd leaned out his fuel mixture early enough to buy himself that extra hour. But he definitely wasn't certain. Just about that time, the Royal New Zealand Air Force Orion caught up to the search and formed up just off of Prochnow's left wing. Unlike the DC-10, the Orion's crew could actually fly 100 knots without stalling. And so they would be able to stay with Prochnow the entire trip into Norfolk Island. And they had search and rescue personnel on board, so if something happened and Prochnow didn't have enough fuel, his odds of survival were significantly higher with them on the scene. About 50 miles out from Norfolk, Prochnow saw the distant strobes of the DC-10 make a turn. They were over Norfolk Island. He now knew exactly how far he had left to go to get to safety. With the Orion now going along Prochnow's side, the Air New Zealand crew had done everything that they could do. Gordon Vett radioed one last wish of good luck and then got on with the business of getting his passengers to Auckland. 30 minutes later, just after midnight local time, after 23 hours and 5 minutes in the air, J. Prochnow brought the little Cessna in for a gentle landing on Norfolk Island. He would check his dipstick after he got on the ground, and it showed no fuel in his tanks. He was down literally to minutes remaining. Aboard the DC-10, Captain Vett got on the intercom as soon as he got the news. The Cessna has landed. He then attempted to apologize for the delay, but nobody could hear the rest of what he said over the cheering. He instructed the chief purser to break open the champagne. He couldn't have a drink, but he thought somebody ought to be raising a glass to what they had just accomplished, and who better than the DC-10's 88 passengers? After he'd recovered for a couple of days from the stress of his ordeal, J. Prochnow took a picture with the Cessna 188 on Norfolk Island to commemorate the thing. And then he loaded it up with fuel and took off for the 8-hour flight to Sydney. A much shorter hop than the 23-hour leg he had just flown. Prochnow and Vett would stay in touch and eventually get the chance to meet in person several years later. And I think there's something pretty important that we can learn from what these gentlemen confronted together and how they went about it. I don't know about you, but for me, this photo is a pretty good representation of how it's felt to navigate all of the changes in our industry over the last couple of years. There are times that I have very much felt lost at sea. Those of us who were around when the internet was invented, don't judge, remember the giant leap in possibility that the internet represented, especially the new social connections that things like forums and instant messaging and social media gave us. The change we're experiencing right now, the rapid emergence and capability expansion of generative AI, feels similar to the advent of the internet in scale and impact. But for me at least, where the growth of the internet was sheer excitement and exhilaration, wrestling with what the emergence of generative AI means for us has felt far more isolating and lonely, especially the second-order effects on the job market and on the future of building software. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the Swiss-American psychiatrist known for her stages of grief model of how humans cope with loss, actually expanded the stages into a more generalized model of how humans respond to changes, especially challenging ones. I very clearly remember the first time I saw AI-assisted coding. I was working at GitHub at the time, and one of my colleagues had gotten access to a pre-release version of GitHub Copilot. I watched him take our standard Golang technical interview, the very same one that we gave candidates, and used Copilot to tab complete his way to a passing version of the exercise, typing very little himself. I spent a moment being shocked, and then I promptly stuck my head just as far in the sand as it would go and left it there as long as it would stay there. Now, Dr. Kubler-Ross says that we don't necessarily progress through these stages linearly, and that's certainly been true for me. I spent a lot of time cycling back and forth between being frustrated with engineers and leaders who were unreservedly excited about AI no matter the consequences, and depressed at confronting what AI might mean for my career and for our industry. And I know I'm not alone. This paper from 2023, friends of lead dev, Dr. Kat Hicks, Dr. Carol Lee, and Kristen Foster Marks, dug into how engineers were responding to the emergence of AI coding assistants. They found that of 2,348 respondents, 45% somewhat or strongly agreed that thinking about how AI is going to change software development makes them anxious or uneasy. And 43% somewhat or strongly agreed that they worried generative AI might make their skills as a developer obsolete very quickly. Now, I'm certain that these numbers have changed since 2023, but I don't have a guess how. So much has continued to change, both in our industry and in the world around us. Generative AI is more capable and more people are using it to help them code, but we also understand its limitations better. We understand how humans and AI can collaborate together to build software in a way that we didn't in 2023. At the same time, we've seen layoffs and staffing slowdowns publicly attributed to AI productivity gains. While some companies are going to great pains to protect their interview process from AI, other companies are mandating that AI usage be documented on every PR to make sure that people are using enough of it. It's so hard to make sense of it, so much all at once. And while our lives aren't at stake the way Jay's Prochnow's was, it does feel a little bit like navigating brand new territory with no landmarks and no navigational beacons to help us find our way, because it's all brand new. But as I've pushed myself to spend more time experimenting with the tools, and I've spent more time talking with peers and mentors about how Gen AI is changing how we build software and how we build software teams, I found myself more frequently able to move past the emotional reaction, to push back on it when it shows up, and move towards a more integrated place where generative AI simply is. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a tool that I'm learning how to use and how to build with and how it's changing the landscape of our industry. And that puts me in a place closer to Captain Vet. As I've gotten my bearings, it's made me more able to help folks on my team and in my leadership community progress along the change curve themselves. What Hicks, Lee, and Foster Marks suggest in their paper to help with this uncertainty is moving from contest culture, where career progress is a Darwinian zero-sum competitive game, to what they call developer thriving, a culture defined by belonging, where every engineer feels valued as a contributor as a person, and learning culture, where growth is a team-level goal and failure is treated as an opportunity to learn. That's in line with Dr. Amy Edmondson's research on the criticality of psychological safety in helping teams operate at maximum effectiveness and innovation. And Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset, learning how to see failures and threats as opportunities to grow and learn contributes to our ongoing happiness and success. As leaders, we're responsible for helping our teams navigate these changes, for providing empathy and coaching and building a supportive environment. But inevitably, sometimes we're going to wrestle with the same uncertainty and confusion that Jay Prochnow experienced because we don't understand the territory ourselves. There's a very important thing that we need to learn from Jay about what to do when we feel that way. Immediately after his expected arrival time passed without having spotted Norfolk Island, he checked in with Auckland Oceanic to let them know. And as soon as he realized his ADF was malfunctioning, he declared an emergency. It's really tempting to try to be self-sufficient and to get yourself out of a mess that you got yourself into. But good pilots are quick to declare emergencies, because the earlier you declare the emergency, the more time the system has to get you help before your life is in danger. It was an easy decision for Gordon Vett to severely inconvenience his passengers and burn thousands of dollars in extra fuel, not just because Prochnow's life was on the line, but because he could so easily put himself in Jay Prochnow's shoes. He knew how that would have felt. I picked this story this year specifically because it's the 10th anniversary of Lead Dev. Not because they asked me to, not that they didn't ask me to commemorate it somehow or anything like that, but as I alluded to at the top of the talk, because of how important this community has been for me and for my growth as a leader. You're likely here for the same reason that I am, because you care about doing the work of leading software engineering teams and organizations in a human-centered way. You're in a room full of people who understand what it's like to do the job that you do, to navigate the same uncertain industry landscape that you're navigating right now, to do the emotional work required to lead and not just manage. A room full of people who can put themselves in your shoes, and you in theirs. Don't miss that. The sessions at Lead Dev are great, and I still reference things that I learned here years ago, but the real magic of Lead Dev, the reason it's endured through so many challenges when so many conferences haven't, it's not the folks up here on stage, it's y'all. It's the community that these events create. The content is here not just to teach, but to spur conversations, to help you find points of connection with other like-minded leaders. If you're struggling with the rapid changes we're living and leading through right now, and I've yet to talk to a leader who isn't struggling with it in one way or another, this is the perfect place to find people to talk through it with. And I think that's the real lesson of this story. Just like flying a plane by yourself, lost and alone over the Pacific, leadership can be a really lonely place, but only if you let it. It can also be a rich community that's invested in your success, helping you grow in your craft and as a person. You just have to be vulnerable enough to let other leaders in. Choice is yours.